This is a talk that I put together in 2019, and over the 2 years, things have changed, so I thought I would try to do it one more time with all the updated stuff that I've learned. My background is computer graphics, so I've worked in commercial computer graphics firms and simulator firms, and a lot of time with video gaming companies. So I retired about 12 years ago, was looking for something to do, and what I did was 3D modeling sort of stuff. And what is Lego? Lego is nothing but a video game in physical form, so I got hooked on Lego. I didn't have Lego growing up. I had like Lincoln Logs and Erector sets and such things. I was introduced to Lego in 2016 by my daughter, who goes, "You know, Dad, there's a Lego Star Wars Advent calendar. Would you be interested?" And I was like, "I don't know." And she says, "I'll just get it for you." And I had such a great time building the little 10 or 20 piece sets every day of December. It's like, I want more of this. And so I went out and I looked at the Lego catalog of offerings to see if there was anything of interest to me, and I came across the architecture series. And so I happen to love the Lincoln Memorial. I think it's a beautiful piece of architecture, and I saw this, and it only had 220 pieces, and it was like, oh, I should be able to handle that. And so I got that for myself, and it was like, oh, this is a blast. I want more. And so I went looking at what other architecture series offerings there were, and about 3 months after I got the Lincoln Memorial, I came out with the U.S. Capitol building. And I'm reading the description of the U.S. Capitol building, and it says, in the same scale as the Lincoln Memorial. I was like, fantastic, I can put them together and they'll fit, that's wonderful. So I got the U.S. Capitol building, and I built it, and I got this. And it's like, where's the Capitol? The front side looks beautiful, the back side's a flat wall. The backside is what you usually see from the National Mall, where they have presidential inaugurations, or they have the PBS 4th of July celebration. They don't show you the front side, they show you the backside. And I saw this and I was like, where's the rest of the model? And coming from video gaming, there's always modding communities. I worked on Sims 3 for many, many years, and the modding community for Sims 3 was very involved, and there was a lot of stuff. So I said, gee, I wonder if Lego has modding communities, and in fact, there are. And so on Reddit, this is what I was expecting the back of the model look like. On Reddit, I ran across a user who had bought a second U.S. Capitol building, used it to finish off the west side, and so he had now a complete building. And it's like, great. And he actually put the plans up to show how to do it, which I really needed because I was so new to Lego. And so I finished that, and it was just like a regular Lego architecture set in that it was just on a flat plane. And so you didn't get that area where they set up for the presidential inauguration stuff. And so I decided, well, I'm going to take it just a little bit further. And so I raised the base of it up so that I could have the western side with the steps going down to the mall and that sort of stuff. And it was like, this is great. I don't know, where are all the rest of the models for the museums and the art galleries and such along the National Mall? And I asked Lego, and I got no response. So it was like, oh, well, if I want other buildings which are along the mall or in DC anywhere, I'm going to have to figure out how to build it myself. So I went looking to see what else was out there. What had people done? Who could I copy? And I saw on Lego Ideas, somebody had done a Jefferson Memorial, which, looking at the picture, I tried to kind of figure out that, and I built that. And all the ones that people had done of the Washington Monument, the sides were just vertical, and the monument itself is tapered. So I had to actually design my first MOC, which was the Washington Monument. And at that point in time, I now had the Capitol, the Washington Monument, a copy of somebody's Jefferson, and the Lincoln Memorial. And I set it out in my living room, and I'm looking at it, and I'm going, hey, wait. I've got the easternmost building on the National Mall and the westernmost building on the National Mall. I've got the center building, the monument, and I've got the Jefferson, which is on the south side. I've got everything I need to line up to build the entire National Mall, which is how this project started. In 2017, like I said, I only started with Lego in 2016. I have only worked on one MOC the entire time I've worked on Lego, and it's the National Mall. My wife keeps saying, you gotta do something different at some point in time here. So anyway, this is what the 16 feet of the National Mall looks like last year. It's been added to, it's almost complete at this point. What I'm gonna talk about is the 4 feet. If you've seen my setup in the exhibition hall, I have just the Washington Monument grounds, which is 4 feet by 3 feet. So I'm just going to be talking about the right-hand section of this entire build. But the process that I have used throughout the entire build. So the first thing is, okay, I have the Lincoln Memorial and the Capitol building, and they're built in the same scale. How do I figure out the scale of everything else that I'm going to build? It's not listed anywhere on the boxes. It's not listed in the instructions or anything. So it was like, okay, how do I figure it out? So I had run across something somewhere in there about talking about LDUs, Lego drawing units or something like that. Excuse me. I needed a way to measure stuff that I physically knew how large it was. Well, I had a Lincoln Memorial, and I knew the Lincoln Memorial was 12 studs wide, 8 studs deep, and about 12 plates tall. Excuse me. So I decided, well, that's a good template to use to measure stuff. And so I did the calculations on what the scale was of the Lincoln Memorial based on blueprints that I found online that had accurate dimensions. And I found out that, of course, the Lincoln Memorial, anything built in Lego, you have to use the Lego parts that are available. So the scale and the height and the width and the depth are completely different. One is 280 to 1, one is 320 to 1, and one is 300 and something to 1. So average about 300 to 1. But because it was so radically different, I said, they have this thing on the box for the Capitol that Lego says built in the same scale. They know what the scale is. I'll ask them. And there were about 5 emails going back and forth between me and Lego customer service about what is the scale of the Lincoln Memorial or the Capitol building. And what it finally turned out was, their answer was, there is no scale. And I was like, wait. How can there not be scale if you say on the box in the same scale? And then they came back and they said, well, perhaps the designers know what the scale is, but that information will never make it out of the design room. And in talking with one of the designers later, the Lincoln Memorial was built like any other Lego set. Whatever worked. They weren't thinking about scale. They were just thinking about what Lego pieces were available. And so they built it out of what Lego pieces were available. Now, at some point in time, somebody actually had to figure out what the scale was to do the Capitol building. But what it comes out to be is, hey, if it looks right, it is right. Because they won't say anything about scale, and I needed something. So I said, okay, we will call it the Lincoln Memorial Unit. Everything will be measured by the Lincoln Memorial Unit. And like I said, it's 12 studs by 8 studs. This slide is incorrect. It's not 14 plates high, it's 12 plates high. So this is an LMU. And what I do is, I use Google Earth, and I'll take a screenshot of it, first of the Lincoln Memorial, and then I'll go over to the area that I'm working on and take a screenshot of that. And then Photoshop, I chop out the Lincoln Memorial, and I use it end to end to measure how big something is. So, in measuring the Washington Monument grounds, it turned out that the dimensions were 144 studs by 108 studs, and I just rounded it up to 112. That way I could use normal base plates without cutting anything up. And I figured I could add a sidewalk or a road or something like that to fill up the rest of the space. But that's how I came out with the scale for the terrain area that I was going to use for the Washington Monument grounds. And so I threw out the base plates on the living room floor and put the Washington Monument in the middle of it, and yeah, okay, that looks good. Okay, I also, not only measuring the terrain, I measured the one large building other than the monument that's on the Washington Monument grounds, and that's the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And it turns out to be 1 LMU by 1 LMU, or about 12 studs by 12 studs is the footprint. And figuring out the height of stuff, since 9/11, a lot of the dimensional information for buildings in DC have been taken offline. So there is no way to get that information. I talked to the Smithsonian Archive, I talked to the National Archive, I talked to the Library of Congress, and they just won't release that information to you, just as a member of the public. So what I wound up doing is, again, using Photoshop, I would get a picture of the building, and with somebody standing by it, I would assume that that person is about 6 feet tall, and then I would measure the height of the building based on a 6 foot tall person. So it's really rough, but it gets you pretty close, and since you're dealing with Lego parts, it's very close. So using the LMU to figure out how large the buildings were, how much terrain I needed to include for the base plates and such like that. Then I looked at, okay, what all is in the area of the Washington Memorial grounds? What is all included in it? You have the monument, you have the African American History and Culture Museum. There are a bunch of smaller buildings that at that point in time, you were just trying to build something that looked like a small building, because the scale that I'm using at is actually slightly larger than Micropolis scale. I'm not sure what the ratio is, but it's in that ballpark. But there were only 2 major buildings that I really needed the dimensions, and everything else was just kind of, okay, well, I'll get close. So now that I knew what buildings were there and how much terrain, it's like, okay, how do I go about getting accurate information about the terrain, about the elevation of the terrain, and that sort of thing? And of course, I didn't want to pay money for it. So over the past 4 years, Google has changed their access to their information, elevation information, 3 times. And so the process that I used the first time through no longer works because Google closed it down. So I came up with a different process, and then Google realized that people were hitting Google Earth and extracting information without paying them, and they closed that one down. So this is the 3rd version of how to extract elevation information using Google Earth without paying Google Earth and without paying money for programs. So what I do is in Google Earth, I map out the area where I'm going to want elevation information. And I overlay a polygon over that area. And that's just to mark out where the edges are. Because the next thing you do is you draw one long path that crisscrosses that area that you want the elevation from. And so I needed to kind of know where the edges were. And the more dense the path, the more elevation information you're going to be able to extract. But let's face it, we're dealing with Lego, where the smallest piece is a 1x1 tile. I don't need anything more accurate than that because I can't use it. And so I create this one line that crisscrosses the polygon that maps out where I want to extract elevation points from Google Earth. From that, I save that as a KML file out of Google Earth. And then I take that KML file and I run it through a program, online program called GPS Visualizer. What the KML file stores is just longitude and latitude data. What the GPS Visualizer does is that it takes that longitude and latitude data, goes off, looks at its database, and extracts elevation data based on each point in that one long line, and then returns to you a GPX file that has longitude, latitude, and elevation. And so now I've got all the information I need to figure out the elevation information for the area I'm interested in. Okay, so the next thing is I take that GPS file and I put it into a freebie GIS program called QGIS, which you can say, okay, here are the 3D points for longitude, latitude, and elevation. Make me a color map of how high or low parts are. And you can specify the spacing between the elevation changes. Since a plate in Lego and the scale that I'm using is about 1 meter, I said, okay, make the spacing between the color differences about 1 meter. And so it returns to me about 13 or 14 different colors, because the difference between the tidal basin, which is the lowest part of the monument grounds, and the base of the Washington Monument, which is the highest point, is about 40 feet. And so that's 12, 13, 14 meters. And so I get this color map. And then with the color map, I lay it back over the screenshot that I took of the area that I was interested in. I cut it out so that the lines are nice and even. And in this particular case, I'm showing you that I'm actually changed the color to match the rest of my talk, because the rest of my talk is based on the first method I used to extract GPS data out of Google Earth. And so I wind up with this color map showing elevation. And then using that color map, I will create a gridded elevation map that I use. And people go, that's really complicated. I mean, you're jumping through a lot of hoops just to get elevation data. Why don't you just use USGS data? I mean, it's out there, it's free. And it's like, yeah, but what they do is the elevation differences between their elevation lines or ISO lines is 10 feet. Well, 10 feet's more than a meter, so it doesn't have the information in between that I need. So you wind up having to do it yourself to get the kind of information that you're going to need for the scale you're building at. So on the left, you can see that's what USGS data looks like. And on the right, that's how much information I could theoretically extract from the data that I got out of Google Earth. I don't need that much, but there's more information there that is useful. So I have this color map, and what I do is, as you saw earlier, I laid out the base plates. And what I do is I create a grid based on the base plates, and I overlay it on the color map. And I know that one color happens to be one particular elevation, and another color a different elevation. And then I go through, and in Photoshop, I fill in each one of the grid points, which is basically where one stud exists. I fill it in to get this gridded elevation map, and that tells me how to build the elevation based on real-world data using Lego pieces for different heights. So on the right here, the picture shows the actual build itself overlaid on the gridded data. And you can see on the actual build itself where the Lego pieces line up with the actual ISO lines that I was using that I got out of the QGIS. So now that I have all this elevation data, it's like, okay, I want to start building the elevation. What do I need to do? You can go ahead and start this. This should be an animation showing laying in the base layer of plates and then building a series of platforms on top of it where the elevation in a large area is very similar. Okay, so I start at one elevation and then I make these large areas just because I didn't want to buy a ton of Lego pieces to fill it in and make it solid. Secondly, it gets pretty heavy with that much Lego layered on top of each other. Third, I needed a place to run wires without having to go through layer upon layer upon layer of Lego plates. So here I've outlined on the right where the platforms are. And then what I do is I fill in the details of that particular elevation. I fill it out so it actually matches the ISO line, but it's based on where the platforms are. So as you can see on the right, where there has been some extension to the height of the platform on the next lower platform, but that creates the ISO lines for that particular elevation. When I first did this, everything was built like a normal architectural set, in that it was on a flat piece of base plate. Then I realized in doing research on the museums and galleries along the National Mall that just about every building has a delivery area underneath it with a drive down to that basement area. So if I wanted to include an accurate representation of what the buildings look like, I would also have to include the ramps down to the underground parking and delivery areas. And so I developed this idea of what I call a crawl space. So I had to actually lift up where the base plates were, and it's about an inch to an inch and a half of open space underneath all my builds. That way, I can build ramps down going to the bottom of the crawl space, and it looks like a ramp down to the delivery area. This also has the benefit of when I decided to do lighting for the mall, this gives me a place to run all the wiring and all the power. And that was a good decision on my part. It wasn't conscious at the time, but I use it heavily now. So on the African American Museum, there are several areas which dip down around the building. One is on the right-hand side, the exit to one of the auditoriums in the building, and that's actually the next floor down. So I wanted to be able to put the stairs in to go and show that you could get to the auditorium. And the picture on the left, though it's hard to make out, shows the ramp going down to the delivery area. So what you just saw in actual pictures. On the left-hand side, that's the ramp down to the delivery area, and on the right-hand side, that is where the auditorium exit is. It also turns out that the African American Museum has a thing called the Oculus, which is this large circular construction. It sits up about 3 feet, and the sides of the circle are glass, and below it is a 2-story open space inside the museum itself with a waterfall. And the waterfall comes from the edges of the oculus, so the circular waterfall. So from above, you can look down to see the waterfall dropping 2 stories down into this large pool. And if you're inside the building, looking up, you can see the light coming in from the outside from the windows around the oculus. But that means at night, when the lights are on, you should be able to see the lights coming up from this 2-story room through the oculus. And so again, I needed that crawl space in order to have a place to put the lights. So doing lighting, it's like, why do you want to light a MOC? One, it's expensive, and it is, and 2, it's just a massive amount of work. Well, to me, the National Mall is magic, especially at night when you can see nothing but the lights. And the buildings are just silhouettes. And when you look at, and I'll show you a picture a little bit later, when you look at pictures of my build at night with the lights on and just seeing the silhouettes, you will be hard-pressed to say, that's Lego, which I thought was awesome. But that meant I had to come up with a lighting system, a power system for all these lights, and I had to figure out where all the lights went and all that sort of stuff. This is what the underneath section of the African American Museum looks like in the crawl space. All the wires, all the connectors, all that sort of stuff is hidden away. It's all necessary, and it's fairly easy to get to, but I just needed a place to put it. Okay, so now that we have this nice elevation built with the different heights with Lego pieces, we need to figure out where everything on the terrain goes, where are the sidewalks, where are the roads, where are the trees, where's the grass, that sort of thing. And so I used the same technique for figuring out the gridded height to find out where the sidewalks were and stuff. And that I would take that screenshot, I would throw a grid over it, and then I would go through and I would color in the portions of the grid that fell over the sidewalks with a tan, that fell over the roads with a gray. And so I would assemble, this is the gridded version of what the terrain looks like. And within the limits of Lego pieces, this is as accurate as you can get. So now I have accurate elevation, and I have accurate placement of what the terrain is. The next thing is trees. So again, I do the same thing with the trees, in that I overlay the grid, I mark where the trees are, but unlike with the roads and the sidewalks and stuff, when you place the trees by where they really are, and then you take a look at the grid, it's like they will never fall exactly on a stud. So you got to go in and you got to move the trees a little bit so that they fall along the nearest possible stud area. So yeah, it's not totally accurate, but we're in the ballpark. And so here's a picture of, with the terrain in place, with the trees located. Okay, so I've got the basic layout of where everything is. Now I have to think about the buildings themselves. The African American Museum is basically a glass cube with some really nice metal work wrapped around the outside. But at night, when you look at it, it glows everywhere. And so my first try was just to get the look of the building. So on the right-hand side, I set up this great system where I could plug in the wedges, and it looked great. It was solid. And then I put a light inside, and of course you couldn't see anything. So I had to figure out how to build it with clear pieces so that when I put a light inside, the light shows out in all directions. Lego doesn't make very many trans-clear pieces in usable plates. Basically, they make 1x2 plates is about the biggest you can get nowadays. So I had to figure out a way to make clear walls out of 1x2 plates that was sturdy enough that wouldn't fall apart. It turns out that I had to use 3 layers of 1x2 plates, crisscrossing them in different ways in order to get the rigidity needed that it wouldn't fall apart every time I touched it. So after I built that as the interior structure for holding the wedge pieces, then I stick the wedge pieces on, put a light inside, and I think it looks pretty close. So part of, for me, doing an accurate representation is getting the details. Everybody can recognize the building, but it really doesn't come to life until the details around that building are in place. And so there were certain things that were very noticeable if you actually go there that I wanted to add. And one was the Oculus, which I talked about, and the ramps and the exit from the auditorium. And part of it was they have this section with very long, thin pieces of concrete and benches. And so most of this has been studs up work. But in that whole area, I had to use snot technique in order to get the thinness needed for the small strips. And then trying to figure out how to fit that smaller section into a larger studs up section. Of course, being rather new, it was really complicated for me. Some of the other details that have been added around the Washington Monument grounds are, there's an outdoor theater called the Sylvan Theater. The National Park Service has an office on the grounds they call the Survey Office. There's the Washington Monument Lodge, which is basically a bookstore, gift shop. There's the John Paul Jones Memorial. So these are all very small parts, but they are significant in that people know that they are there, and I wanted to be able to add them. And so, in looking at the entire Washington Monument grounds, I had to figure out, okay, where are all those different areas that have things of interest that I want to add? There was the German-American Friendship Gardens, which when I went to visit had not been maintained and it looked terrible. There's the 17th Street levee. Washington, D.C., when it floods, the floodwaters from the Potomac and the tidal basin go down 17th Street till they hit Independence Avenue, take a right turn and go into downtown Washington, D.C. And I believe the last big flood was 1984. And after that, they decided, we don't want to keep flooding downtown. We need some sort of levee system. So they have built across 17th Street a removable levee system where the sides are always in place, but when the rains come and they look like they're going to be bad, they can come and they can drop in slabs that will stop the water from getting to downtown. Okay. Another part, after I actually built all this, I looked at it and I said, it's dead. It doesn't look like anybody's there. It doesn't look like something that people can relate to because there's nothing going on. And then I decided, how do you make somebody believe that there's activity? And that's through vehicles. There was no way I was going to be able to get anything that represented people, which I would love to be able to do, but at the scale that I'm working at, it just doesn't happen. So the next closest thing that implies people are vehicles. So I did a lot of research on the buses and the vans and the taxis and the police cars and all that sort of stuff. And I came up with a set of vehicles that are appropriate to DC that I could then start placing on the roads. And once I started placing vehicles on the road, it started to come to life. It started to look believable, like people were actually living and working and traveling around. And after I did my first round, I said, I'm getting pretty bored of seeing the same kind of cars and stuff. There's got to be other stuff that goes on. And so I came up with a second round of vehicles, which included delivery trucks and cement trucks. And in DC, you will constantly see trucks driving around with signs on them. Usually they're political in nature. So I did vans and other things to try and break up nothing but taxis and buses and police cars. And when I added those, all of a sudden it was like, okay, I can believe that this is alive and active and a vibrant town. This is the picture I was talking about. I took this picture. I set up the Washington Monument grounds in my living room, and I backed off into my dining room, used a telephoto lens, and took this picture all the way across the width of the house. I didn't know what I had until I saw it on the computer, but it looks very much like a picture that you would get if you were on the Potomac River on a boat and you took a picture. This is when I realized how important lighting really is to making your architectural build really feel alive, because you don't see a lot of detail. When you look at this, yeah, you can tell that the Washington Monument is not, smoothly sloped, but you don't necessarily say, that's Lego, because you go, that's DC, isn't it? So the next thing was, okay, I've got trees and sidewalks and roads and vehicles. Now I want the lighting. Where do I put the lighting? How do I figure out the lighting? So I looked at what was available. Well, from Lego, any of the lighting is like minifig scale. So if I were to get one of the Lego streetlights, it would be, and if you look at the right-hand side of this picture, that's a Soyuz rocket. And so if I put a light or a lamppost from Lego next to the Lincoln Memorial, it would be as if I put a Soyuz rocket next to the Lincoln Memorial in real life. That just wasn't going to work. So I had to figure out, okay, how do I get something that looks smaller? So my reference is the tree. All the trees are about this size. What other Lego pieces are about that size that I might be able to use as lampposts? And so I had a bunch of these ideas, and they just weren't quite there. And Joe Mino, who's the editor of Brick Journal, said, Wayne, there's this guy who does custom light work. You might want to talk to him. His name is Rob Klingberg, and he runs Brick Stuff. And so I got a hold of Rob, and Rob said, I've got an idea for you. Why don't you use a Lego lever? And I'll put my smallest light on it, and we'll put shrink wrap around the wires that go up to the LED. And when you look at it, it'll look like a lamppost. And sure enough, this was his initial photograph to me, was, you think this looks like a lamppost? I was like, absolutely. And so I had him build me a bunch of custom lights to be able to use with the build. The biggest thing that we found out is when you start to build smaller and smaller, not only do the buildings and the pieces you use get smaller and smaller, the lights get smaller, and the amount of illumination that a light puts out gets smaller. That's not something I thought about originally, so the first lights I put out there were just blasting an incredibly large area and didn't look realistic. This is the light map that I used to figure out where to place all the lights. And the illumination areas are basically the yellow circles. And so when I went back to Rob and I said, this is great, I love the look of the lights, but they're just too bright. Can you do anything? And he says, sure, we can throw a resistor on the lights to bring the light level down to the point where there should be dim enough that they look like they're at the right illumination for the size that you're building. And as a matter of fact, when he did it, we used 1 milliamp resistors, and his comment was, he knows more about electronics than I do, it is just above the level of where the lights start to flicker because they're not getting enough power. If you wanted it any darker, I couldn't do it. I was like, great, this is working for me. So in setting up the street lights or the light placement, I did exactly the same thing that I did with the trees. And I put a grid over the screenshot. I figured out where the lights were. Then I took a look at the actual grid and I adjusted the light position so that they actually fell on studs, and that developed this map. The other thing that this map helps with is there are 4 lights that light up the Washington Monument. I need to figure out where they were located. And there are security lights around the African American Museum, which are a different color and brightness than the regular street lights, and I needed to figure out where they were located and make the appropriate adjustments. The other thing that Rob did, and he said, I was testing beta 0 of his design. I was the first to really push this, and he thought it would be appropriate, is rather than having connectors between every single section, because each section was lit independent of the next section, but I still needed to connect everything together, he says, I've got some magnetic connectors. I think they might work for you. And it was like, well, okay, I'll give it a try. And so he gave me the magnetic connectors. It was really rough in form. I am now up to the 3rd, 4th generation of magnetic connectors that he's made, and there's a reason for that, and I'll explain it in a bit. But the first generation of magnetic connectors made hooking up the lights this easy. Go ahead and play the video. I could live with that, especially doing shows. The amount of time that you would be required plugging and unplugging stuff, setting up and breaking down, it was like, all I got to do is push them together or pull them apart. And I was like, great, I will, yeah, I'm there. So with the custom lights that Rob provided and the magnetic power connectors, my lighting system has been incredibly flexible and easy to work with. So this is what it looks like when I finished putting in all the lights, and I was quite proud that how good it looked. And I'm working in our living room, and we have an upstairs, and my wife is going up the stairs, and she looks down at it, and she goes, you know, there's a big dark area in the middle. I don't think there's supposed to be a big dark area in the middle. And sure enough, I went online and I took a look, and at the base of the Washington Monument, you have all these flagpoles, and you have lights that light the flags around the flagpoles. So it was like, oh great, now I've got to figure out how to light flagpoles. So this was my concept. I think purists out there, avert your eyes. Because this requires drilling. I had to take a 1x1 tile, drill a hole in the middle of it so that I had a place that the light could come up and light the flagpoles. But I have the lighting for all the flagpoles looks like it's built into the base of the Washington Monument. And so when I actually did get finished, it looks like this. So you can then see in the middle that those lights really do make a difference. So some of the problems in dealing with this, part of it has to do with how they physically built the real National Mall. When Jefferson first designed what the alignment of some of the buildings, along with Lafont, they thought that the Washington Monument would fall exactly between the Lincoln and the Capitol and the White House and the Jefferson, and that it would all be on, exactly on latitude and longitude lines. When they found out that the spot that they wanted to build the Washington Monument, the ground was so unstable that they couldn't put it there. They had to move it 330 feet to the southeast. And while moving that 333 feet to the southeast, yeah, the Capitol and the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial do in fact line up 1 degree off of latitude. And it was like, oh man, how do you do 1 degree in Lego? You don't. So I did a lot of fudging with my screen captures so that I had everything lined up at right angles. So it's not exactly correct because my build is actually nicely laid out on a grid, but the actual place itself isn't. The second thing is what you actually see on the display floor is what the mall looked like in 2018. There is constant updates and refurbishings and rebuilding and replacement all along the National Mall. I mean, right now they're working on the Air and Space Museum and making major changes on that, on the exterior. They made a major change on the exterior of the Natural History Museum that I haven't included yet. And so it's like, do I want to keep up? Or do I just want to say, hey, that's just the way it is in 2018, live with it? I would like to be able to make some of those improvements, but they require a fair amount of unbuilding and rebuilding. I haven't done it yet. The biggest problem for me is I'm from Utah. I don't live in the DC area, so I can't just run out over the weekend to check if something I'm building is correct. And so getting really good reference is critical to trying to do an accurate build. And the only way to get good reference is to do it yourself. You're not going to go online and look at Google Images and see really good reference images, because most of them are people taking pretty pictures or people taking selfies, which are useless to you if you're doing an architectural build. So you really have to go there yourself, and it's really helpful if you have a good camera and lens to do it with. Now, my wife has done consulting work out in DC, and so I will occasionally tag along and spend days doing nothing but wandering the National Mall taking reference photos. So far, I've probably spent, over the period of the last 4 years, a week to a week and a half doing nothing but wandering the mall, taking pictures. It turns out that you can get accosted by security officers for taking pictures on the mall, as I've been accosted 3 times and demanded that I give over my camera and stuff. But anyway, so just getting the information, I depend a lot on Google Earth. One thing is Google Earth actually updates their imagery fairly regularly. So what you see is not 4 years old, but maybe 6 months old, which is really helpful. But you really got to go. Anyway, and then as you make changes, the problem is I didn't start out with the idea that I was going to do the National Mall. I started out with the idea I was going to make a bunch of different independent buildings. And then when it grew into the National Mall, my problems of going back and retrofitting things so that everything worked together started to get really, really messy. And I've learned a lot. And what I learned was, if you're going to take on a big project, realize you're going to take on a big project and plan it from the beginning. The other thing is, right now, what I have at the large size is 16 feet by 3 feet worth of National Mall. And that's just between the Washington Monument grounds and up to the Capitol building. I plan, I hope, to actually finish it out to the Lincoln Memorial, which will add another 12 feet. So, I'm talking 28 feet worth of building here. Doesn't fit in my house. 16 feet really doesn't fit in my house. It's very, very rare that I get to see the whole thing together outside of a Lego event. I love Lego events because it allows me to actually see everything put together and take pictures. So I build on usually 1x1 base plates or 1x2 base plates at a time, and then I check the fit of the other pieces just around it, but I don't ever really see it in context of the full build, and that sometimes gets to be a problem. One of the things for me is to help yourself in doing a good job of getting accurate information is got to learn photography. And a smartphone might be okay, but you're probably better off with something better. So along the way, I have learned a bit of photography so that I can get good reference material. That's my Flickr site. The only reason I'm on Flickr is it's the first social site that I ran across that I could put something up, and I just stopped. So I never got to Instagram or I never got to Facebook or anything like that. I just stopped at Flickr. And for me, the Flickr site is kind of a building diary as opposed to, let me show you these terrific photographs. I use it to remember what I did. So if I have to go back and retrofit something, I know that I've got pictorial information about what something looked like, and that's what I use it for. And if you haven't yet, you can see the Washington Monument grounds on the display floor. A couple of quick notes, thank yous to the people at my local Lego store. When I first walked in 2017, I was so green that I didn't even know what they were talking about, and they took the time to teach me. Joe Mino, who has pointed me to a lot of different resources that have been really helpful. Rob Klingberg with the Brick Stuff Lights. Brick Slopes, I'm from Utah. This is my home Lego event. Brickcascade was the first big event I ever attended. I went out to Brick Fair, Virginia. It turns out in Utah, when I set up the National Mall, and at Brick Slopes, I had more people coming up to me and going, "What's a National Mall?" And I spent more time explaining what the National Mall was as opposed to what I'd actually done. So I wanted to get it in front of people who knew what the National Mall was so I could talk about how I'd done it. So I went out to Brick Fair, Virginia. I'm going to go out one more time. And my wife, there are approximately 2,000 trees on the 16 feet, and my wife built most of them. So I'm indebted to her immensely. And that's my presentation.